Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Samantha and this is transirl. Tonight we have a wonderful conversation lined up for you on this, our last episode of season 2. I can't believe the season's already wrapping up here. I'm honored to be joined by a wonderful voice in the Indigenous, trans, and queer community, and we'll be discussing important topics in both trans and Indigenous representation and the lenses through which these cultures are presented and understood. Joining me in the transirl control room is the amazing Stephen. How are things looking up there in New York as we get deeper and deeper into fall?
Sam, for years and years, I've always dreamed of being able to do the weather. And so I actually have my chance now. So I present to you the current peak fall foliage map, courtesy of the website Smoky Mountains. There are a lot of great... We are actually here in Long Island a little bit, and this is sort of a view outside of the transirl control room.
Okay.
And we're a little bit behind here as far as fall goes. It's been a little bit warmer than usual. The giant tree that's there below is a Japanese maple, which I affectionately call my gossamer tree. And it hasn't lost its leaves yet, but you can see some of the trees are starting, but yeah. So I think we're a little bit behind, quite honestly. But that has been the fall foliage report, which you can only find here on transirl.
That's it. What are your thoughts wrapping up this season here tonight? I can't believe it. I mean, it feels like we just started. On one hand, it feels like we just started. On the other hand, it feels like, oh my gosh, thank goodness the season's finally over.
I do feel like that, yeah, sometimes. I think I've definitely felt everything, and that's the amazing thing about this show is, like, I think you do feel everything. You feel joy, you feel elation, you feel sadness, you feel frustration that sometimes buttons don't work, or angry that I've pressed the wrong button or didn't do something correctly, but it's just really been an amazing experience, and we got through 19 of these. This is the 40th episode of the season, and it's just really been an honor. Doesn't even describe it, and it's just been amazing the amount of people that have been on, that we've been able to talk to, that have been heroes to me. The host and the guests have been heroes to me, and I know it's a lot of people watching. So it's been an honor and a pleasure, to say the least.
Well, this show wouldn't be what it is without your diligent work behind the screens over there. So thank you, not only for myself, but from everyone who's watched the show. We wouldn't have such an amazing show to watch if you hadn't reached out to me and helped me get this second season up and running. So thank you for all your hard work. You've really done just above and beyond what I ever could have expected from anyone on this show, and I'll be forever grateful for that. So thank you.
And it's been an honor. And thank you also to everybody who joins us. Every time we do a show, we have a bunch of our regulars who I know will have the discussion going. And when I have a chance, I'll be able to pop in and say messages here and there too as well. So thank you all.
All right. And as always, if you do have any questions for tonight's guests, please submit them in one of our online live chats. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the episode. So with that, let's go ahead and get to our guest. Tonight, our guest is a second-year PhD student studying higher education. They've made a presence for themselves online as an educator, photographer, and scholar, focusing efforts on reflecting what it means to be Diné and transgender in a culture impacted by colonization and trauma. They are the curator of the popular Diné Aesthetic Instagram page, where they work to educate and lift the voices of Indigenous creators. And tonight they have graciously offered their time to discuss these topics in depth on the show. So with that, I would like to welcome Charlie Amaya Scott to the show. Charlie, welcome.
Yay! Thank you so much, Samantha. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you on the show this week. It's our last show of the season. And I just, as soon as I saw your page, and I was talking about this a little bit earlier, I was just in love with your presence, how outgoing and beautiful your photography is, your work in inspiring and educating others. I thought it was really important to have you on here and hopefully help us understand some of these topics in a little bit more detail. But first, I wanted to start by giving you a few minutes to talk about your experiences growing up, a little bit about your family, and when you first realized that you didn't identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Samantha. Again, it's an honor to be here. So I grew up in the central part of the Navajo Nation in a small town called Chinle, Arizona. A population size I think is about 10 to 15,000 people last I checked, but that's based on a 2010 census number. So I was born there in the Indian Health Service unit, which is pretty much like I believe our version of a hospital, but it's specifically for Native Indigenous people who live on the Navajo Nation, or any sort of like Native Indigenous community who has that. So grew up there. I My parents separated around 2009, and I believe that was around a time that I first sort of started talking and sharing my truth to my mother that I am sort of queer. And I didn't really sort of grapple with my gender identity until I believe 2015, when I was actually abroad in Ireland. And it was so interesting. Like, in this moment of culture shock, I was sort of like questioning, like, who exactly am I, both within the global context, but also within my community. And that's when I started sort of try to figure out like who I am via my gender identity.
Okay. Um, what did that process look like for you, coming out? What were the experiences you had coming out to your family, friends?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny, particularly so my mother was very accepting of my sexuality. And I think with my gender identity, it was sort of I didn't have the words to describe like what I was going through, and I couldn't communicate like the complexity I was sort of dealing with and unraveling. And so it was a sort of like struggle for her to try to figure out like what exactly does it mean. But I've said to my mother, like I don't identify like as a man and I don't identify as a woman. I'm trying to figure like what that means. And I know at first she just said okay. And then as we started to have more conversations about what that meant, it sort of became very clear that she still didn't quite comprehend like what that meant for me. I remember her and I would get into arguments about pronouns, about how she would refer me to other people, how she would talk about me. It felt like she sort of like didn't want to understand, but at the same time was struggling to also figure out what that meant. And I think for me, it was hard because like I didn't. I'm so used to like my mom just like unconditionally loved me that I felt like I was being sort of, for lack of a better words, I felt like I wasn't being heard, and I wasn't sure how I can communicate that to my mother. Thankfully, though, during this time of COVID, I actually spent a lot of time with her back home. I like
Hmm.
went back like right before my spring break for my this year. I actually went back home and decided to like stay with them throughout quarantine. And that's when we started to have like these real critical conversations of gender identity and conversations around that. And she is a lot more understanding. She's a lot more willing to hear me. And I'm just so happy that we're at that point because it's been 5 years of like trying to communicate something that I thought I knew very clear, but evidently in the last 2 years, it's something I had to sort of clarify with my mother, especially with my sister as well.
Oh, okay. I am curious because you sort of mentioned that your journey was more of an ongoing journey, right? It wasn't something that you
Mhm.
figured out all at once. You identified as queer first and then came out again. Um, are there any parallels between that journey of your own identity and of your own gender identity as with your cultural identity as well?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. So, like, growing up within the Navajo Nation, I was just surrounded about around my culture and my language, around my community, that leaving it just made it seem so much more precious to me. Like I thought that I knew who I was until I left my community, and that's when I had to really grapple with like who I am. And then I was going to an Ivy League institution. I was sort of like encountering these questions of what does true solidarity mean? Like, what does it mean to sort of be an advocate for justice, especially during a tumultuous time when Black Lives Matter was emerging and police brutality was becoming a much more recognized, visible global issue. And so as this journey of like coming to know myself, it also became a question of like, who am I really too as well culturally? I feel like 2015 was that pivotal moment of when I was abroad that I was like, I became much more stronger in my sort of identity as like a Diné person, yet also as a queer person. And then there was this emergence of like what it means to also be trans as well.
And I think one of the great things you've done is started to share some of those stories too, especially those stories of cultural significance on your Instagram page and how they tie into your identity, not only to the traditional Diné cultural representation of gender, but to how you present outwardly today. And we actually have um, one of your posts here that we can share. Why do you find it important to share these stories with others?
I think it's important because I never had these conversations growing up. I never heard stories, I've never seen representations of people like me who are being both visibly queer and trans and Diné. Like, I think it was just, I think 2 or 3 years ago that we've had the first Pride event on the Navajo Nation. And then I believe around, I think sometimes between 20, I think it's 2010 is when this idea of like same sex or same gender marriage also became a global issue. And it's so strange, like how on the Navajo Nation, like that was even sort of like banned and taboo. And so I find it so important to sort of share these stories because, like, I think folks need to know that, like, there is such a fluidity and there's such a beauty and there's such a sort of evolution of becoming that's so integrated throughout our stories and culture that they've sort of become stagnant and static because of colonization. And so when I share these intimate details without basically sharing like in detail of traditional practices, but rather the sort of spirit of it, I find that people are willing to listen. People are willing to sort of engage, like, what does it truly mean to basically exist in this 21st century colonized world?
And I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit more because I think it's important to discuss how gender was represented in pre-colonial Diné culture. If you
Yeah.
could share a little bit about how gender roles were classically understood
Mhm.
and how were trans individuals represented?
So, to be quite transparent, I kind of don't see not see, but I kind of like don't sort of I try not to compare gender and sexuality, our contemporary understanding of it, to what it was or what it could have been before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I've sort of named it as a sort of positionality in my community, and the ways that which like our stories tell us how to be in relationship with each other. And so the way I've sort of come up with it is that like you know who you are based emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and oh my gosh, there's a fourth one that I cannot recall, but it's not physically. Like gender or your identity wasn't rooted of like how you look or even to your genitalia. Like there's actually a creation story or one of the stories part of the creation story in which the what we know as At'a, which roughly translates to first woman, she created the penis and the vagina. And then once she created those, she would gift them to the children once they go through a particular ceremony, and the child got to choose like, okay, maybe like this child wants a penis, maybe this child wants a vagina, maybe this child wants both. Like there was such a sort of like um not claim, but there was such a like acknowledgement of like being to choose respect. There was such a respect for choosing that people had, and there was like consent in that I find that is not is not as recognized and available as today, unfortunately.
And within Diné culture, was there an opportunity for um, a trans individual to be represented?
From what we understand of trans, yes. And the way I've sort of come to understand my transness is this sort of transcendence of identity. There's a sort of becoming to know who yourself, that process of coming to know who yourself. And that's a journey that was so common in our community pre-colonization. And so people may not, if we were to use my definition of what transness is, then yeah, everyone in my community would identify as trans because there was that process, that sharing of knowledge of like who you were and who you could become.
So going from that traditional understanding to where the community is today, especially with where trans and queer issues stand in the modern day Navajo Nation, what issues do gay, queer, and trans people face present day?
Oh my gosh. I think of, I don't know where to start. Like, I know earlier I talked about how, like, same sex and same gender marriage is not recognized, and still to this day, it's not recognized. There is a sort of movement to get it recognized, but then I'm like, okay, yes, that's great. Yet, there's also two other issues that I always like to sort of reference, and that the other one is that trans women, in particularly, are not allowed and are not encouraged to participate in the sort of pageantry that's so common on the Navajo Nation. One of the biggest pageantry is the Miss Navajo Nation, and they have an explicit rule that you must have and always been female, which is inherently trans misogynistic and sort of grinds my gears when people don't talk about that, especially because the pageantry is so openly celebrated throughout social media. And I'm just like, I feel like sometimes I have to be that like hater of like, hey, just so you know, they're trans misogynistic because they don't let trans women participate. And then the other thing that I think a lot of people, it's so awkward because like this is where you get into space of like recognizing tribal sovereignty and then thinking about federal involvement. So I know back in, I believe, I was either June or July, the Supreme Court released that, I think it's Title 4, Title 5 of the Civil Rights Act, I think, of 1965, that protects LGBTQ plus individuals from being fired in a federal workplace. That does not, Native nations as they stand as tribal sovereign nations don't have to follow that Supreme Court ruling. And so it's this awkward moment of like, yay, yay, like LGBTQ plus folks can't get fired from a federal workplace. Yet they can get fired from a Navajo Nation government position on the Navajo Nation for being LGBTQ. And so
Got
it's
it.
like I'm just like like I love my nation. I'm just like I wish y'all did better at supporting people like me.
So let's talk about that a little bit more because you talk about the traditional understanding of
Mhm.
identity in Diné culture, but then we find the Navajo Nation today, or at least from a legal standpoint, the Navajo Nation today is not very welcoming. There aren't protections in place for LGBTQ individuals. Trans people are explicitly excluded from certain events.
Mhm.
How do you explain this shift over time from where things were to where they are today?
I feel like the simplest and most successful answer I can say is colonization. But then I feel like that excuses and sort of generalizes the violence. So when I always refer back to the American Indian boarding school era, in which Native children were sort of forced to attend these institutions of learning that were often started and founded by a religious organization and then were publicly funded by the government. And so the intentions of these boarding schools was in a lot of ways quoting what's that dude's name? Something Pratt. I always forget his name, but kill the Indian, save the man was what he always quoted and is well known for. It's Carlisle. I think it's Carlisle. But anyway, and this idea was like you want to sort of rid rid the cultural aspects of who someone is. and then reproduce them into a understanding of civilization. And so in these boarding schools, children were divided by their genitalia. If you had a vagina, you were forced to one part of the school. Your hair was combed and braided in a certain way. You were wearing specific clothes, a smock and a dress. And so there's this process of, there's this gendered indoctrination that's happening of these children. And on the other side, the same could be said for those who are seen with a penis. And it's like this violent stripping of gender being forced upon these people, and it's a foreign identity to them. And so they're forced to adopt these sort of aspects of like who you are through gender presentation. And then from there, whether they escape or not, or whether they graduate from these institutions, they're bringing back that type of trauma and violence to their ancestral homelands, and then they reproduce them because there's a fear of being retaliated. And that's the best way I can explain like how that type of gendered violence exists and continues to persist on an Navajo Nation.
I mean, it's really terrible what was done to Navajo and so many Indigenous people in Arizona with the schools that were set up here. And while it feels like it's something that was a long time ago, it really wasn't. The largest school here in Phoenix didn't close until 1990. This isn't ancient history. This isn't the 1940s and 1950s. We didn't know better. These schools still existed in some form into the late 20th century. But I think you
Yes,
touched on it, that generational trauma that these type of institutions basically brought, as people went back to the Navajo Nation, they brought these pains, these traumas back with them.
unfortunately, I just really found out that my grandfather was in a boarding school, and that's it. That's basically how close it is to me. Like my grandfather went to a boarding school. I have aunts and uncles who also experienced some aspects of the boarding school experience.
One thing I did want to touch on as well, for trans and queer youth in the Navajo Nation, what type of resources do they have available to them right now?
In terms of queer and trans supportive resources,
Supportive resources, education, anything.
from what I know, there's not anything official from the Navajo Nation. But there are community members who are doing the work and labor to support queer and trans youth. Like there's one of my close friends whose Instagram handle is Sexist Ceremony. They have this thing called the Res Condom Tour, and they pretty much do sexual education and try to promote safe sex practices, especially with like a sort of Indigenous queer and trans lens, which is, I think, so needed and so helpful. But other than that, I don't think there's any other sort of things that I know that exist besides the Navajo Nation Pride coordinators an event who are trying to also sort of, I think, maintain some sort of relevance and presence when it comes around supporting queer and trans youth.
Okay. I did want to shift a little bit and talk a little bit about Indigenous, trans, and queer representation in the media. I'm curious, do you see it today? Do you see representation in TV, movies, books? And if so, what does that look like to you?
So I see it to an extent. So I know, so I just recently started Lovecraft Country. And there's this one episode where they have a person who identifies as Two Spirit. And Two Spirit is a very inclusive gender. It's very inclusive of a variety of gender and sexual identities. But the character exclusively and shared that they identify as Two Spirit. And it was just so spoiler alert. they killed the character literally within 5 minutes of their appearance. And I'm just sitting here like, okay, but what was the point of that then? What was the intention behind that? And then if we were to compare that like 5 minute of representation to one of the most recent books that just came out, Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, it's kind of sad because, well, the thing is though, Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, what she does is literally, I describe almost all the characters as like queer and trans. But just so folks know, Black Sun is a pre-Columbian base inspired fantasy book that talks that sort of like follows these three different characters as they navigate uh different like political factions, different forms of violence. It's wonderful. And yet there's, I think, about one of the main characters had a romantic relationship with someone who uses Z them pronouns, which would personally read as like, oh, they're trans. They're possibly non-binary. And then another side character um, is a trans woman. Like she reads as trans, like a trans woman. She was like, oh, like you knew me by this name, but this is my name now. And then you have one of the main characters who is read sort of like as bisexual or pansexual. Like she just enjoys sex. She enjoys the good time. And it's so different because like you have all these characters and they're being everyday badasses with trying to sort of like navigate the world and survive basically a possible apocalypse. But they're also like they're just like I don't know, they're just like having fun along the way. There's like such a humanity attached to them that I just don't see related to Indigenous, queer, and trans characters, especially in the realm of trauma. I remember when I was talking and openly celebrating this book, there was a lot of people who are like, "Oh, you should like read this book, or you should read that other book," and I love the authors and I love the characters that they're coming because they're so complex. I think I'm a little like done with having to read trauma and having to sort of like basically have to read about my own trauma in these pages of these books. Like it's real and these stories need to be shared. It's just not something I want at the moment. I want joy. I want badass trans characters. Like I want all these like phenomenal things. I want this complexity that you everyone else has. And by everyone, I kind of mean like white folks.
I think that's a really great answer, and it's definitely something that's lacking in trans representation in general. Are positive stories, or stories where being trans isn't necessarily the entirety of that character, right? That there's more to this person, that they are actually living their life and enjoying their life. And I think that's such a great example of writing a trans or queer character who is so much more than just their gender identity, and that is really great representation.
Yeah, like what I really enjoyed about what Rebecca Runhorse is. So she's a cis native black native woman, and I would also I never talked to her about her sexuality, but she never like explains to the audience that they're trans. She'd be like, oh, this person uses these pronouns, or
Mm.
like she would refer to that person through their pronouns. And then she would also, and then there was that story of like, oh, you knew me as this one, but I'm this now. And I would think you would appreciate that. It's like, instead of telling us, it's showing us.
Yeah, and that's a really unique and kind of cool perspective. I like that. So going from the media to actually just focusing on the queer community in general, what does visibility
Hmm.
look like for Indigenous, trans, and queer people within the queer community?
I think visibility is sort of like listening to our issues. Like, I, one of the frustrations is I think people don't really understand like how interconnected and woven our issues are. And I think particularly for Indigenous, queer, and trans youth, because we experience homophobia, we experience transphobia, we experience colonialism, we experience like all these instances of violence, like it's just so up in our face. Very similar to like what's happening with Black trans women as well. Like they're facing anti-Blackness, they're facing misogynoir. It's like everything is just all up in your face. And then when you have like the larger queer and trans community not paying attention or not even listening to us, it gets frustrating. Like, who exactly then are we like who exactly is for us besides each other? And how exactly can we sort of maintain these lines of solidarity and communication? And so I think in terms of visibility, I just want to be heard. I want to be seen.
I mean, I think that's beautifully stated. I think it's an issue throughout the queer community, throughout the trans community, where
Mm-hmm.
voices are being hidden, voices are being lost. And you're absolutely right. There needs to be a conversation across the entire community for how can we be more inclusive? How can we share these stories? How can we lift up our trans and queer siblings of all backgrounds to have the same visibility, to have the same understanding that so many other people have out there. And I think your page is doing some fantastic work in building that visibility. But the reality is, I mean, there's so many more people who are also trying to be heard and are also contributing. And I can tell you from working through Instagram, for example, Instagram is a great tool for reaching out to people, but those algorithms will work against you in getting your message out beyond your smaller group, right? It's always
Mm-hmm.
fighting the algorithms to try to get your message beyond other people who share the same history, culture, beliefs. It's sort of confining at times, and I think for many of those minority voices within the queer community, it's always a struggle, or it's been a struggle to elevate beyond just that local conversation,
Mm-hmm.
right, to the larger community. And I think that anyone who considers himself a part of the trans community or queer community, especially online, not only needs to be aware of that, but needs to be actively engaged in the conversation. Well, what are we doing about it, right? I mean, we can
Mm-hmm.
sit here and we can talk about this here, but how are we making sure that Indigenous trans voices are being lifted up? How are we making sure that they're being heard? How are we making sure that they have the same opportunities that others have? And I think it's on all of us in the community
Mm-hmm.
to be asking those questions and to be working together, because the reality is we're stronger together than we are apart, and we are all part of this community. Um, I think we lose visibility of that sometimes, and there's a lot of work to do.
I agree, yes. And working against the algorithm is just so it's fascinating. There are things I'm like, oh, I was not expecting this to go viral. Okay.
I mean, there's goodness in there too, but it's a fight. It's a
Mm-hmm.
fight to be heard, especially
Mm-hmm.
in the noise of everything else that's out there. I did want to give you a chance though, because I thought you wrote something really beautiful for the trans is beautiful hashtag. You shared this great post, and again, if you're not already following Charlie on Instagram, these are the kind of and here's the page here, right? Diné Aesthetics. You do such a great job of putting together these educational but meaningful contributions to the conversation. And this was such a beautiful story that you put together here.
Yes. This is where I center the process of becoming, of like what it means to be Diné, and how basically I would argue that queer and trans Diné youth are more authentically Diné than anyone else, and they're following a tradition that is sort of like lost, is sort of like not welcome and celebrated as it used to be. But what I've learned in my experience is like it's better that I speak from my experience and integrating these cultural stories and just sharing them. I'm just glad that people are willing to read it and willing to like listen.
So beyond Instagram, what are some of the other ways you're working to increase visibility and understanding of Indigenous queer topics?
So I actually do a lot of like workshops around this. And it's so fascinating to me. So when I used to live in Providence, Rhode Island, I would do these conferences and workshops both in the local area, and then I started to gain a sort of like significant request from outside the New England area in terms of like people wanting to like know more about this, wanting to like, okay, like what is gender and sexuality from an Indigenous lens? And I started being like, well, it's not really there, but like this is like what it could have been, and this is what this is what it was, and this is what it could have been, and this is what I think it should be. And so I do a lot of like education outside of social media. I like something I've learned and something I'm sort of like grappling with is like talking to people across a variety of issues and always trying to center at the epicenter of like my philosophy is always trying to center in Native, Indigenous, LGBTQ2S plus folks, myself and others. And I always try to sort of make sure that they're part of the conversation. I actually earlier today just got off a meeting and this person was like, is there anyone you like want to bring it on? And I was like, yeah, I want to bring this person on because like they identify with what you're talking about and are wanting. And I think like me having a conversation with them and then also making sure that they're getting paid is important. And then recently I just sort of finished consulting on creating a digital platform called IndigiTikTok. And I wanted to make sure that like who I was inviting also were both allies and also people who were on the spectrum of being queer and trans. And so not only am I like, doing these workshops, but I'm also trying to make sure that like I'm also bringing people with me because I know that like I have a foot in the door being one an Ivy League graduate for undergrad, two have had been able to sort of create this platform, and three known to be critical both within the field of higher education but also within social media. And so I want to continue to make sure that like the people I'm bringing with me and the people I'm uplifting are people who share identities like me. And I know, and even though all of this is outside my community, I'm slowly, I used to do a lot of like, I used to do a lot of presentations around college access in my high school. And being queer and trans, I also would share narratives of like, yeah, so like, like English pronouns are they, her. And then that would like spark a conversation like, oh, like, what does that mean? And then that's gives me an opportunity to talk to basically 15 to 17-year-olds of like, oh, talking about gender identity and sexuality.
I think those are some incredible opportunities. And I loved how you engage others in the community as well, right? It's interesting whenever any of us are tapped on the shoulder to contribute to an educational piece about being transgender or queer culture, because ultimately we're just one person, right? We're one person living our experiences through the lens of our lives. So when you have that opportunity to not only share your story, but also lift up others and allow them to share their story as well, I think that's really inspirational.
I
So,
agree. Oh,
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, I agree because one thing it's so awkward is people always expect me to be that one voice, and I'm just like, no, no, there are many. Here are a list of other people that have shared or even have added more to the conversation or at a sort of like more complex understanding of it than I am. I also try to make sure that like if I'm being invited to something, I'd be like, look, listen, I don't know this. And so I'm going to decline this, but I do know someone who might know more. And so I would also offer an opportunity for them to connect to other people.
And having those connections is such an important thing, right? Because we can't carry everything on our shoulders. Being able to point people towards other resources is always important. As we've both learned, it can be overwhelming to get stuck trying to create content. But for people out there who are interested in listening to, learning from, and supporting Indigenous queer creators, what's the best way for people to do that?
Literally, if you see someone that has like Indigenous, queer, and trans, I would say just immediately follow them, look at their content, engage with their content, like, share, comment. It helps with the algorithm. But something I think people are a little hesitant to do is like I would just say like also financially support them, send them money. It's one way of like being seen. It's a one way to making sure that you can afford food that day. And something I tried. So I also recently started like on my blog a list of Indigenous LGBTQ2S plus artists that folks can support. They can follow them. They can buy their artwork. And the reason why I started making this list is because like I'm so tired of people naming these like big influencer brands, which do a lot of great work, yes. But oftentimes I'm like, you're cis, you're straight, you have a particularly acceptable body and beauty standard. Like, I want to center the ones who are not welcome in these spaces, the ones who deserve, in my opinion, who deserve more to have a platform than most folks. But and so that's I would say that's one way is just literally if you see us, follow us, um, share our content, buy our content, that sort of thing.
And you said you had that list up on your blog, correct?
Yes, I do. It's literally one of the headings, or it's literally it just
Perfect.
says Indigenous LGBTQ2 plus artists.
So your blog, we've got it up here on the screen, or we can bring it up again here really quick. Here is your homepage, dinéaesthetics.com. And people can also reach you through Instagram.
Hmm.
And what's the TikTok name again?
It's the same handle as Instagram, Diné Aesthetics. Recently went through a
Oh, it
rebrand.
is.
I was like, let me just make sure these are all
Okay.
connected and the same.
Okay.
The only one
Very
platform that's
good.
different is Twitter, because I'm just like, I just love my Twitter handle.
Um, no, I think that's pretty much it for my questions. The only other question I had, you mentioned that you're finishing up your PhD here. I'm curious, what are you thinking for the future as you look ahead?
So it's kind of funny because my research interests are not they're not what I educate people about actually. So my PhD is in higher education, which is the study of how colleges, universities organize, function, and operate. And what I am particularly interested in is how settler colonialism influences the organization of a college or university, and also the role of social media with these institutions. And then I like to like add like, oh, but also how do colleges basically colonize Black Indigenous students of color? And so, yeah, I'm just like the end goal. I've been telling people the end goal is to be a president of a college university, but I've been sort of like reflecting upon like what exactly do I want to do? And it's all up in the air, and I think that's perfectly fine. But I do know that I am excited for whatever the outcome of like whatever I publish and wherever I go. So I'm just trying to like go with the flow at this point with my degree.
I think that's great. No, thank you so much for answering my questions here. I mean, this is enlightening for me. It really is, and I think it highlights again just that disconnect within the queer community. There are so many unique stories and unique backgrounds out there, and they can be invisible. They can be invisible at times, and I think that's one of the greatest tragedies of the current state of social media is how so much can be hidden. And I really appreciate you taking the time to explain a little bit more of your story, your journey, not only for myself, but for all of our viewers as well. I did want to get to our viewer questions. We do have some questions that were submitted online earlier this week. So let's go ahead and get over to those here really quick. The first viewer question I have, what do you envision for our future, or yeah, what do you envision for our future children embracing a harmonized essence?
Oh wow. Hmm. What do you envision for our future children embracing a harmonized essence? I'm a little confused, but also I'm like, I think I get what they're trying to say. Um, but I think what I envision, if we're thinking about the future and we're thinking about Indigenous queer and trans youth, or just like queer and trans youth in general, I just want them to just be unabashedly happy. I just want them to feel supported and celebrated and like not having to feel like they have to hide parts of themselves, because like once you get to that point of just loving yourself unconditionally, you will break and change the world.
I love that. I love that answer. It's true. All right, our next viewer question here. Do you find LGBT spaces unaccepting due to their focus on Western or colonial concepts of gender?
Immediately, yes. Yet, I understand that those spaces were meant for a particular person in mind. And if I am welcome, I also am hoping that they're willing to listen to what I have to say and also willing to challenge them. I have been part of like LGBTQ plus spaces, um, and they're always like they're willing to listen. I think it's like when you know when the world is against you, you try to find solidarity and connection with someone else. And you're trying to like learn and process together with like what it means to survive in a colonized world. And then once they understand it, like, oh wait, the reason why I'm feeling homophobia and transphobia is because of colonization, then that's I'm like, yes, you get it now.
All right, our next question here. Is there room in our culture to embrace transgender individuals in a renewed way? And this was from another Indigenous creator on Instagram.
Yes, there is definitely room for my culture, your culture, any sort of Indigenous culture to embrace trans individuals, because this thing with being Indigenous, the thing with being Native, the thing with being a sort of like having that story and connection to your homelands is evolution. There are ways to sort of like embrace and celebrate individuals with a new sense of love and a renewed sense of acceptance. Like, yes, I know there are communities that did have gender in their stories of creation history. Yet also I think there's a possibility for them to be to like not have, and to also like reconfigure like what does it mean to be Indigenous now. Like I am all against not romanticizing my ancestors, and also challenging them and challenging myself too to be a better person, and challenging my community to be better. Like when I talk to people in my community, I don't say like, "Oh, I'm sacred." I'm just like, "Look, listen, I am just as Diné as you, and you need to also celebrate and support me."
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I dropped out for just a second there. I apologize. All right. I did hear all of your answer, but my video cut out at the very last second, so I'm sorry. Um, Final question submitted through Instagram here. What are your opinions on transphobia and biphobia within the LGBTQ community?
I just want to know why is that there?
Ryan?
Like I don't understand. Like I mean, like, yes, I understand because of like, colonization. We're trying to like work through all these like different logics that are ingrained in ourselves. But also, I'm just like, listen, the world is against you. Why are you putting someone else down? Like, why are you trying to basically be a colonizer? Like, I don't like you're like, listen, the world doesn't like you, but you want to be part of that world. I'm just like, okay, if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm gonna go do some work over here where I celebrate like folks who are trans and folks who are bi. Like that's where I'm a community at. If they support me, I'm gonna support them.
I think it's wild that we still have to deal with it. I was actually in an event earlier this week. It was actually an educational event where we were talking about the queer community, and in there, another queer identified individual uh, kind of made a flippant comment about having to use their pronouns because this individual doesn't see how that's needed in their identity and in their presentation. And that one caught me off guard, but it was another example of sort of this disconnect within the community at times where there's still a lack of acceptance in a lot of ways of trans identities, of gender identity beyond cisgender individuals that we're still fighting through. And that was just another reminder that, oh my gosh, I don't know how we're still doing this, but we're still doing this today.
Right? Like literally, it costs us $0 to be kind. It can cost you your livelihood and job if you're being hateful.
Right? All right. We do have some questions that came over in the live chats here tonight as well, so I want to get to these. It looks like the first one we have is, while still living submersed in Diné culture, do you have any, or did you have any mentors or role models to help come to terms with your gender identity?
I'm assuming this person is asking about living role models. Unfortunately, I would say no, which is so interesting because I felt like I was so recluded, and I didn't realize like how much like queer and trans people were in my life until literally I think like once I turned 20, I was like, wait a second. But then when I think about role models and people I think of as people who sort of like inspired me to sort of reconfigure and think about like what it means to be queer and trans, I think about the stories and lives of Wewa, who was a phenomenal Zuni individual. A lot of people automatically assume Wewa is Two Spirit, and I'm always arguing like, no, Wewa is not Two Spirit. Wewa and her community, and I'm totally going to butcher this language, so I'm so sorry if there's any Zuni individual watching this. Wewa identified as Ihamana, which is a particular different positionality within their community and had a different understanding of like roles and responsibility. And then I think about the narratives of the sort of the first twins of who we now know as first men and first women, and they were called the Nagle. And for them, gender was not a construct. It just didn't exist. They were neither man and neither woman as the translations go. And so I think of them as a sort of like mentor. And then I think of like a well-known, respected medicine individual, Hustine Claw. But the thing is though, by his very name, he identifies as Hustine, despite medical records indicating that his genitalia was that of what we now know as a hermaphrodite. But then I think about his narrative and how he has defined who he is and who he wants to be. And so it's these stories of the archive that have sort of mentored me and pushed me to sort of like reconfigure like what does it mean. I think in a lot of ways it's sort of like the work of like what Sadia Hartman does, who is this phenomenal Black scholar, and one of her theoretical frameworks, critical fabulation, was actually the crux of like how I wrote my undergrad thesis, in which I'm sort of like trying to represent these stories in a way that I feel is more authentic and more critical of like what it means to be Diné.
I think that's a wonderful answer there. And we have just one question left. It's kind of a fun question for you. So a hypothetical. If you could be the president of any university, is there one you would choose?
Okay, is this more of like a me trying to like mess up the system type of vibe, or me just like wanting to just like have fun?
I don't know. Mess up the system sounds kind of fun right now. I'm in kind of a mess up the system kind of mood.
Okay, so I have jokingly said that like, oh, like I'm gonna be president of Brown University and like, you know, tear down that school and give it back to the local native indigenous community, or even Harvard. But then I'm like, you know what? I don't think that's like technically ever going to be possible. But one university that I
do you think they'll publish
be...
that in the alumni guide? You know, they could have your picture in there. And what's Charlie doing? Oh, she's dreaming of tearing it down.
I can only imagine. So there's that. But if we're thinking of like one that I really do want to be a leader of, that's something close to home, is actually Diné College, which is literally half an hour from where I live, and it also was the first tribal college within what is now known as the United States. So I feel like that one is more possible and something that's close to my heart. But if I want to sort of like, you know, continue to like mess up colonizers' lives, I'm like Harvard or Brown so I can take them down.
Oh my gosh. Well, I can't think of a better way to end the show than on that note. Charlie, thank you so much for your time here tonight. This has been really enlightening and a really important conversation. And I wish you continued success in your endeavors, not only in education, but also online and in the creation of media and tools to help people continue to better understand your history and the history of other Indigenous, queer, and trans individuals. So thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you so much, Samantha. Again, it was an honor, and I'm just so happy to have had this conversation with you.
Thank you. Well, I think that's it. We'll bring. I guess. Sorry, gosh. You'd think by 40 episodes in, I know how to do the show, right? But apparently, I don't. This is the end of season 2. But if you haven't already seen some of the other episodes in this season, we've had some fantastic episodes, fantastic guests. Please check us out on our YouTube page at transirl. All of our previous episodes from the last 2 seasons are up there. You can watch those whenever you get a chance while we're on our little break here. We're also over on transirl show on Facebook and on Instagram at transirl. Instagram is the page where you'll get the latest updates if we are or when we're coming back. And right now we are planning on being back for season 3 early in 2021. So something to look forward to there in the very near future. Yay! And now we all are. We did it, Stephen. We did it.
We did it. A nice smooth landing with a wonderful, wonderful guest, and just so grateful to have you on and be our closing act for season 2.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephen, as well.
Just a wonderful guest. Thank you again, Charlie, and thank you to all of our guests this season. We've had just so many fantastic conversations here. I'm really proud of the work that we've done. Again, thank you to Stephen for directing, doing a wonderful job behind the scenes. Thanks to Addison Zimmerlin, who also contributed a lot to the creation of the show, and Thomas Cole as well. But for all of our viewers out there, thank you for your continued support and participation. We're very much looking forward to bringing you more amazing guests and amazing stories next season. And we hope to see you back here again very, very soon. So from all of us here at transirl, thanks for watching and have a great night.